When in September 1943 American generals looked at the map of Europe, they saw something that resembled an impenetrable wall. Behind the beaches of Normandy, behind French fields and cities, waited a concrete monster. The German West Wall, full of bunkers, guns, and steel dragon's teeth. Every invasion plan ended in the same place, right at these fortifications. It was then that an idea was born so crazy that even today it is hard to believe. Create a tank that will not stop for anything, not even a concrete wall with a thickness of 2 meters. Thus began the history of the slowest, heaviest, and most absurd tank in the history of the United States Army. The T28. Engineers from Detroit received an almost impossible task. Create a machine that was to break through every bunker, survive every hit, and destroy every obstacle. It sounded like a dream of immortality, until someone tried to calculate this vision into tons of steel. The project was named Super Heavy Tank T28, but among the soldiers who later saw its monstrous shape, another name immediately appeared, the Doom Turtle. The concept was simple, and at the same time catastrophic. The T28 was to have armor with a thickness of 12 inches, or over 300 millimeters on the front, which made it almost impenetrable by any gun at that time. On paper, it looked impressive, but the very first mass calculations terrified everyone. The T-28 weighed almost 97 tons. That is more than 2 Sherman tanks put together, and a fuel truck for good measure. Engineers warned that such a beast might not move from its spot. The Army, however, did not want to listen. They needed a miracle, not reason. The first drawings resembled something between a fortress and a locomotive. Instead of a turret, a huge, immovable block of steel with a gun of caliber 105 millimeters, mounted in the hull like in the casemates of a medieval castle. Soldiers were to shoot from it like from mobile artillery and not like from a tank. The idea seemed archaic even then, but in times of war, every dream of invincibility looked attractive. Officers spun visions of how the T-28 leads the attack, ignoring German guns, punching through concrete, and driving through the ruins of bunkers like a ram made of steel. As the first models were created, reality began, however, to resemble a grotesque. It turned out that the monster needed not only a huge amount of fuel, but also special bridges, because no ordinary one was able to support its weight. The roads on which it was to move cracked beneath it like thin ice. To solve the pressure problem, designers came up with something exceptionally bizarre. The T-28 had double tracks on each side. In theory, this was supposed to distribute the weight. In practice, it looked as if someone attached a second tank to the tank. And although documents wrote of an innovative solution, soldiers looked at this creation with a mixture of fear and amusement. The biggest absurdity, however, was that this whole machine was to be powered by an engine from the T-26, which had barely 500 horsepower. That is more or less as much as in a luxury sports car, only instead of 2 tons, it had to pull almost 100. When one of the officers asked the engineer how fast this steel monster would be able to go, the answer stuck in everyone's memory. So slow that you can walk next to it and smoke a cigarette. In tests, this was painfully confirmed. The maximum speed amounted to 12 kilometers per hour, and the recommended 11. If the tortoise from the fable about the hare and the tortoise took part in this race, it would win without a problem. Despite everything, work continued. Pacific car and foundry factories welded subsequent parts. General Steel Castings delivered monstrous armor castings, and the military still believed that the T-28 would make it to the front to break the German wall. But time flowed, and Europe was changing faster than America was able to weld steel. When the first hull was ready in June 1945, the war was practically ending. Japan was still fighting, but peace reigned in Europe. When in December, this colossus was finally transported to Aberdeen Proving Ground, instead of to the front, commanders could only shrug their shoulders. Their miracle weapon no longer had anyone to attack. One of the soldiers who witnessed the arrival of the T-28 recalled later. When we saw it, we didn't know whether to pray or laugh. It looked like a fortress, but moved like a tractor in mud. And indeed, when the T-28 drove onto the proving ground, the earth trembled, but not because of its power, but from the effort with which it tried to move. It needed a full 2 minutes to accelerate to the speed of a bicycle. When someone asked if they planned to mount a radio in it, an ironic answer fell. What for? Before it gets to the front line, the war will end by itself. At that moment, the T-28 began to transform from a proud project into a subject of jokes. Military newspapers wrote with enthusiasm about the indestructible tank. but jokes were already circulating among the soldiers. Some claimed that if the T-28 ever drove into Europe, it would only be to block roads. Others joked that it is not a tank, just a moving bunker that forgot it should stand in place. In a certain sense, they were right. No one knew how to actually use it. The war created many strange machines, but the T-28 was unique. Not because it was the biggest, but because its existence was proof of how desperation can blind reason. At that moment, no one yet knew that its story was just beginning, and that instead of a symbol of power, it would become one of the most absurd chapters in the history of American weaponry. When the first hull of the T-28 finally left the production hall in Seattle, engineers understood that their work did not resemble any known combat vehicle. It had no turret, its silhouette was low and stretched, and the armor on the front looked like a bunker wall. What in assumptions was to be a modern tool for breaking through defensive lines began to look like an experiment that got out of control. The steel culverin was so heavy that the transport of its fragments alone required the use of special railway wagons and cranes that until then had moved only bridge elements. The first problems appeared even before the assembly of the whole. When technicians tried to fit the huge armor castings, they discovered that their tolerance was minimal. 0.5 millimeter of error was enough for the structure to jam. Welding works lasted for weeks. Every subsequent stage resembled a surgical operation on a steel giant. When they finally managed to close the hull, everyone stood in silence. The monster weighed over 90 tons, even before the engine was mounted. Despite this, in August 1945, the T-28 was ready for trials. Transport to the proving ground in Aberdeen became a separate logistical undertaking. A special set of trailers and tractors was needed to transport the tank from the Pacific car and foundry plants. Roads in the state of Washington were not prepared for such weight. The asphalt buckled under the Colossus, and on bridges, soldiers laid additional steel plates to prevent a catastrophe. During one of the crossings, a bridge on a small river shook so hard that drivers were ordered to get out and walk before the vehicle carefully rolled to the other side. When the Colossus finally reached Aberdeen, no one knew how to unload it. Ordinary ramps did not withstand the weight, so a makeshift structure was built from thick beams and iron supports. Officers watched the entire operation with anxiety. One mistake could end in disaster. When the T-28 drove onto the ground, its tracks dug into the soil like anchors. The machine did not so much stop as embed itself into the earth. The first engine start was a spectacle that resembled an attempt at resuscitation more than the start of a combat vehicle. Mechanics fought with engine choking and problems with the electrical system. When finally the power unit roared, thick smoke filled the entire proving ground. After a few minutes, the T-28 moved. Very slowly, with difficulty, as if every turn of the track costed effort. Soldiers looking at the test began to laugh under their breath. One of them reportedly said, "That's not a tank, that's a steel snail." On asphalt, the tank reached a speed of merely 12 kilometers per hour. On gravel, even less. When they tested it over a short distance, engineers calculated that with a consumption of 6 gallons of fuel for every mile, the T-28 burned more than a B-17 bomber during a combat flight. In military reports, they began writing about extreme fuel consumption and insufficient mobility. This was a polite form of defining failure. An even bigger problem turned out to be the operation of the vehicle. The crew numbered 4 men, but access to the interior was so uncomfortable that it required acrobatic agility. The driver sat in a tight compartment, almost without visibility. The commander and loader had it little better. All the time they were surrounded by thick steel, which heated up in the sun like an oven. After several dozen minutes of work, the heat inside exceeded 40 degrees. The only machine gun the T-28 had was a heavy machine gun of caliber 1/2 inch mounted on the roof. To shoot from it, the commander had to lean out through the hatch, which in practice meant that he had to stick his head out in a place that every opponent would hit without difficulty. Such a solution aroused another wave of irony among soldiers. One of the test reports stated coldly, "Commander exposed to fire in order to operate the machine gun. Consideration of additional shields recommended." In practice, everyone knew this meant one thing. The project was simply poorly thought out. The decision to use double tracks did not help either. Yes, they distributed the weight, but every replacement or removal of the outer segments required several hours of work and cranes. Officially, it was stated that the operation takes 2 hours. In reality, no one was able to do it in less than 4. When someone jokingly suggested that the T-28 could transport its spare tracks on a cart itself, an officer replied, "Yes, but then you would have to hire a second army to mount them. All this was beginning to resemble a parody. Sentences appeared in army documents speaking of extremely limited operational capabilities, which was an elegant way of saying that the tank was not suitable for any form of combat. Even road transport posed a problem. Every bridge had to be checked beforehand, and many roads required repairs after the passage of the T28. On the proving ground in Aberdeen, a few more endurance tests were conducted. They checked how the armor reacts to fire from anti-tank guns of caliber 88mm. The results were impressive. Shells bounced off the armor like stones off a wall. However, no one could find sense in a tank that was resistant to everything, but was not able to reach the battlefield on its own. When in January 1946, the second specimen of the T-28 was delivered to Fort Knox, the military realized they had created a machine without a purpose. The German bunkers for which it arose had long since lain in ruins. The war had ended, and the doomed turtle was only beginning its slow wandering. When the Second World War came to an end, the T-28 was still in the trial phase. When its monstrous silhouette first appeared on the proving ground in Fort Knox, generals already had a new problem. Not with how to use it, but what to do with it at all. The German bunkers for which it was created had long since turned into ruins. In the face of peace, this steel machine, built with the thought of breaking front lines, looked like a relic of a bygone era. At first, they tried to pretend that the T-28 still made sense. Official reports spoke of an experimental test program that was to assess its potential in offensive actions. In practice, it was only about justifying the millions of dollars spent. Concrete obstacles simulating German fortifications were set up on proving grounds. The powerful gun of caliber 105mm was to demonstrate its power, punching through meter-thick walls. The results were impressive. Concrete cracked and shells tore obstacles to pieces. However, after every shot, the tank had to wait a few minutes for the vibrations to subside. The structure itself was not adapted to frequent fire. Too heavy, too stiff, too slow. The biggest problem still remained mobility. During tests in Aberdeen, the T-28 traveled a total of about 870 kilometers, of which over 400 were on gravel. In theory, this was to prove its durability. In reality, it only showed how difficult it was to keep this machine in motion. To cover this distance, it needed over 100 hours of driving and consumed almost 13,000 liters of fuel. Mechanics joke that the T-28 does not drive on gasoline, it drinks it. Every attempt to drive out ended with a series of breakdowns. Overheating engine, breaking suspension elements, worn tension rollers. The list of problems grew with every kilometer. It often happened that during the drive, fragments of covers fell off or loosened bolts fell to the ground. Engineers said half jokingly, half seriously, that the T-28 leaves behind a trail of steel tears. Even the smallest repair required cranes and specialized equipment, and every day of testing cost a fortune. As subsequent reports reached the staff, it became clear that the T-28 had no future in a modern army. The war showed that mobility and speed are more important than armor. Meanwhile, the T-28, with its speed of 11 kilometers per hour and huge fuel consumption, could not keep pace with any armored unit. When analyzing the possibility of using it in a potential war with the Soviet Union, officers resigned after a few days of calculations. This tank was not able to cross most European bridges, and transport by rail required dismantling the outer tracks. In the meantime, controversies began to appear around its name. Some officers claimed that the T-28 is in reality a self-propelled gun, and not a tank, because it has no turret. In March 1946, it was officially renamed Gun Motor Carriage T-95. Just a few months later, after further consultations, they returned, however, to the original name, Super Heavy Tank T-28. This change had no practical significance, but was a symbolic confirmation of the chaos that reigned around the project. During one of the tests on uneven terrain, the tank got stuck in mud so deep that its floor touched the ground. 2 bulldozers were needed to pull it out, and the whole operation lasted over 6 hours. When they finally managed to get it out, one of the soldiers commented, "We don't have to worry that the enemy will destroy it. It is enough if it rains." This sentence then circulated through units as a joke that best captured the essence of this project. In subsequent months, they still tried to use the T-28 for engineering tests. They checked how much load bridges and transport ramps could withstand. It was the only case where the monster actually came in handy, as a moving weight for experiments. Mentions appeared in reports that its mass provides valuable design data. In practice, This meant that instead of fighting, the T-28 became a measuring tool. In Fort Knox, firing trials were also conducted to assess the effectiveness of the gun and armor in various conditions. The results again confirmed one thing: firepower impressive, mobility tragic. Commanders who just a year earlier spoke of a steel revolution were now silent. The Army was starting to run out of arguments to maintain this project any longer. At the beginning of 1947, the decision was made to transfer the second specimen of the T-28 to Arizona to the Yuma base. It was to serve there for tests of bridges and floating structures. The transport itself was already a challenge. At every stop, fastenings had to be checked and steel plates placed underneath, so the Colossus would not sink into the ground. In the desert climate, the T-28 coped even worse. Its cooling was not adapted to high temperatures. Soon after arrival in Yuma, a tragedy occurred. During tests, the engine caught fire, and the fire spread throughout the entire vehicle. They did not manage to save it. The second specimen burned down completely and was written off as a loss. In this way, the Army lost half of the entire program. Only one T-28 remained. Heavy, slow, and completely useless. Instead of becoming a weapon that was to demolish German fortifications, it became a monument to misguided ambitions. For many soldiers, it was a symbol that sometimes even the most advanced technology makes no sense if it cannot move faster than a human with a backpack. After the fire of the second specimen in Arizona, the fate of the T-28 program was basically sealed. Technical reports clearly indicated that the project no longer had any combat value, and its maintenance consumed resources that the Army needed elsewhere. However, in the world of military procedures, nothing disappears immediately. Before anyone dared to officially close the project, it was decided to use the remaining tank for experimental purposes. Thus, the first specimen of the T-28 became an experimental object in load tests. Engineers from Aberdeen and Fort Knox used it to check the load-bearing capacity of new bridges, landing ramps, and transport structures. Paradoxically, in this role, the machine proved useful. Not because it knew how to fight, but because no one else could replace it with weight. It was like a moving weight, ideal for checking where the endurance of steel ends. During these tests, it was discovered that even on paved terrain, the T-28 could leave deep ruts behind it. The soil buckled under its almost 100 tons of mass, and with too fast a turn, the outer tracks tore out fragments of asphalt. Service soldiers joked that every passage of the T-28 is a free geology lesson. At one moment, someone even proposed using it as a machine for compacting soil, but the command quickly cut the topic short. The jokes were already too close to the truth. Although officially, the T-28 remained in the records as test equipment, with time it left the hangar less and less often. The Army gradually lost interest in this colossus, and new, faster tanks like the T-29 or M46 became the priority. In quarterly reports, increasingly shorter mentions appeared next to the name T-28. No activity, maintenance in inactive status. With every year, its presence became increasingly symbolic. A relic of ideas from times when it was counted that force could replace reason. In the winter of 1948, it was decided to transfer the vehicle to Yuma to continue research on floating bridges. However, before that happened, plans were changed. It was decided that the T-28 would remain in the East as a training exhibit. No one, however, took care of its actual maintenance. The tank stood forgotten on the sidelines of the proving ground, exposed to rain, snow, and corrosion. With time, it became overgrown with grass, and its armor was covered by a layer of rust. For new soldiers, it was just a strange steel lump that no one could exactly identify. Photos from that period have been preserved in archives. The T-28 stands alone, with track segments unscrewed as if someone started its dismantling and gave up halfway. Nearby lie abandoned tools, remnants of cables, broken steel plates. There are no traces that anyone was still interested in it. Official documents from the end of the 40s record it as lost in a fire, although in reality, nothing of the sort happened. It seems that for the Army, it was easier to write off a loss than to admit that no one knows what happened to it. Through the next years, the topic of the T-28 practically disappeared from military reports. In the new era of the Cold War, no one had time to reminisce about the slow colossus that never reached the front. When the Pentagon analyzed the future of armored weaponry, the name T-28 no longer appeared in any discussion. It was like an unwanted experiment that everyone preferred to forget. However, despite the official silence, rumors circulated among soldiers and engineers. It was said that the tank was transferred to the south and hidden in one of the warehouses. Others claimed that it was sunk in a lake during bridge tests. Still others were convinced that the military intentionally hid it, so it would not become an object of press mockery. Time passed, and no one could indicate where the last specimen really was located. In the 50s, the history of the T28 was already forgotten. Younger officers heard about it only from anecdotes, and it was said that it was so slow that if it started in 1944, it would reach Berlin only in 1950. Others joked that it is the only tank that could lose a race with its own projectile. These words, though funny, well reflected the moods. The T-28 had become a symbol of military style over substance. The irony of fate was that its only benefit lay in the fact that thanks to it, better load-bearing standards for American bridges and landing ramps were developed. In military archives, it was therefore recorded not as a weapon, but as a test device of large mass. Thus ended its service. Without glory, without battle, without sense. Finally, in documents from 1949, a laconic entry appeared. Vehicle T-28, status unknown. There was no longer a trace of America's biggest and slowest tank. It disappeared as if the earth had swallowed it. Years passed. No one mentioned the T-28 anymore, and its existence passed into the category of military myths. Documents that could indicate where the last specimen ended up were lost in archives. For the Army, it was a closed chapter, a project that was better not recalled. Until a certain autumn day, when an accidental hunter in Kentucky stumbled upon something he could not immediately recognize. In dense bushes, on the outskirts of a former military area, he spotted a rusted, huge lump of metal. Initially, he thought it was the wreck of some tractor or a fragment of a bridge structure. Only when he walked closer did he see the characteristic tracks and massive, low silhouette. On the front, under a layer of rust, the stamped marking was still visible. T-28. The tank, which officially ceased to exist over 2 decades earlier, lay before him in the undergrowth, abandoned and forgotten. News of the find quickly reached military authorities. Initially, no one wanted to believe it was really it. Only after thorough inspections was the authenticity of the machine confirmed. How it found itself in this place remains a mystery to this day. Perhaps it was transported there from Fort Knox after the completion of tests and simply abandoned when funds for its maintenance were lacking. Regardless of the cause, over the years, nature took it over completely. Tree roots grew into the tracks, moss covered the armor, and small animals took up residence inside. In 1976, the decision was made to extract the Colossus and transfer it to the Patton Museum in Fort Knox. The transport operation itself turned out to be almost as difficult as building the tank. Before the trucks could move, the armor had to be cleaned and reinforced so it would not crumble after years of corrosion. The tracks, welded together by rust, had to be cut and reconnected. The whole action lasted several weeks and required cranes that usually serviced mining equipment. When finally the T-28 drove out of the forest, its sight made an impression even on those who knew its history. Although scraped and covered with dirt, it still looked like a steel monster from another era. For some, it was a symbol of the ambition of American engineering. For others, a reminder that even the most powerful technology can turn out to be a dead end. During transport to the museum, however, an incident occurred that only added another absurd chapter to the legend of the T-28. The truck transporting the tank had problems with brakes during the descent from a small hill. The powerful mass of the T-28 pulled the set down, and the driver failed to stop the vehicle. The Colossus slid off the trailer and landed in a ditch, raising a cloud of dust and mud. Fortunately, no one suffered injuries, and the tank itself suffered only minor damage. For observers, it was almost symbolic. The Doom Turtle, which never made it to the front on time, was now trying to escape, even from the flatbed. Short notes appeared in the military press about the failed transport of a unique vehicle. In the environment of military enthusiasts, jokes quickly began that the T-28 finally achieved its speed record, falling off the truck. After repair, the tank finally made it to the museum, where it was restored and placed on outdoor display. Over the next decades, thousands of visitors viewed it, often not realizing that they were standing before one of the biggest engineering misunderstandings in the history of the American Army. With time, it was transferred to Fort Moore in the state of Georgia, where it is located to this day. Contemporary base employees recount that during the moving of the machine, one of the cranes refused to work. As if the tank itself was rebelling against another move, the T-28 survived contrary to logic, not because it was a success, but because no one had the strength to destroy it. Too heavy to scrap, too absurd to forget. Although it never fired even one shot in a real battle, It became a reminder that sometimes the line between a genius idea and a complete fiasco is very thin. Today, its huge armored body is silent, but it is silent eloquently, as proof that in war and technology, the one who builds the biggest monster does not always win. And so ends the story of the world's slowest tank, created from ambition, buried by reality, and saved by chance. A tank that never reached where it was supposed to fight, but despite this became a legend. A legend of failure, weight, and irony. If you like this story, leave a like, write a comment on what you think about this steel colossus, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss subsequent tales about strange, forgotten machines of war.